Hey everyone, this is the Into the Future podcast at the University of Mary Hardin-Baylor. Our alma mater states, we're ever thankful for our past, and into the future we will go. That's why on this podcast, we highlight stories of light from our past to bring hope for the future. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Into the Future podcast. I'm so grateful that you have decided to view our podcast today. I am, as always, excited to introduce today's guest. Today, we are blessed to have Mr. Larry Locke join us. He is the Associate Dean of the McLane College of Business and a professor. He has multiple titles, including licensed attorney, journal editor, and minister. He is the husband to Lisa, and they have 3 grown children, and so they also have 3 grandchildren. And he is known for his wisdom and positive influence here on campus. I am so excited for him to join us today. Welcome, Larry, as you're preferred to call.
That'd be great, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, as you know, we start every episode with the same question. We're ever thankful for our past, into the future we will go. So if you could share your favorite memory of being here on campus.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for having me today, Ms.
Absolutely.
Berg. I have a lot of memories from campus. I didn't know about UMHB until I came here to go on faculty, right? In 2010, I didn't know anything about it. I think I met one person from UMHB in the years before that. So I didn't know a lot when I came here. And one of the more significant memories for me was a couple of years after I arrived. I was diagnosed with cancer, actually 2 separate kinds of cancer in 2 different places on my intestinal tract. So it was pretty serious business, yeah?
Yeah.
These 2 different kinds. One of them was 2nd stage, one of them was 3rd stage. It was pretty dicey. And I was teaching here one summer while I was in treatment. And, in summer, the classes are long, right? So 3-4 hours, at a sitting
Yes.
in the summer. And I was teaching 2 classes on the ground. We don't do that anymore in the McLane College of Business. We've moved all of our summer classes online, so it's more convenient for students who want to be at home. But at that time, we offered them on the ground as well. So I was teaching these 2 classes. And I was going through radiation and one of my rounds of chemo and multiple surgeries. And I was not well, right? I was quite sick and dizzy, and I couldn't drive. There were a lot of things I couldn't do. I couldn't stand up for very long. And so my daughter, who was a student here at the time, I'd been teaching in Gordon College before 2010 up in Massachusetts. And one of my daughters had just graduated. And one of them was a sophomore, and so she came with and decided that she would. I hope that encourages your listeners that we eat our own cooking here. But she decided to come with and transfer down to UMHB. And so that summer, she would drive me to campus every morning, and she would carry my bag, with all my books in, and she would take me up to the classroom, sit me down in a chair, hand me a Boost, and then come back and get me in 3 or 4 hours. And then she'd take me back to my office, and I'd try to kip there for maybe 30 minutes and then go back and do it again. And she just took such great care of me. And she took one of my classes, so there was some sort of benefit for her. She was an economics major, so she knew one of the classes I was teaching. And so she sort of hung with me there as well. And I wanted to do it, and I was happy to do it, even though I was so sick, because it turns out that while I'm teaching, I think it's probably true for all of us, right? While you're teaching, you're not thinking about how miserable you feel, right? I'm talking about business law. I'm talking about management. I'm talking about things that are important and interesting and getting to mix it up with the students. And it's just the alternative is sort of sit in your house and every 5 minutes look at your watch, say, well, I still feel horrible, And so that was a great summer for me to be teaching, despite the fact that I was so terribly sick. And one of my students that summer was the eminent Mr. Tucker Glaske, now, in charge of development for the university.
Yes.
So, yeah, he was a student of mine, very proud of him. And he was in class with me that summer. I think he also remembers that time because I looked so deathly But one of the reasons I think is it's important memory for me is because it sort of concreted this idea of how important what we do here is, right? I mean, despite the fact that I'm, quite unwell, feeling terrible. I mean, everybody's sort of cancer story is their own, right? But let's just suffice it to say that chemo and radiation are as horrible as everyone says it is. Yeah. And my chance of survival was less than 50%. I mean, I had some pretty invasive cancer. But when asked the question, what shall I do this summer? I need to teach at UMHB. I need to do that because what we do here is terribly important. And if this is the time that I have, however time that I have, as long as I'm called to be here, it's an important thing for me to do. And so it sort of cemented in my own head the purpose of what we do here and the importance of what we do here. That even if you're unsure, whether you're long for this earth, that it's a very meaningful sacrifice to make. It's a very important thing to do. This thing that we do here in terms of providing Christian higher education.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I did not know that about you, and it's amazing. How many summers ago was that?
I would have been 10 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And how did you grow in faith during that time? You were sharing that you had less than a 50% survival rate.
Yeah, it was really a time of tremendous growth for me. Um, it's it takes sometimes those sort of moments for God to be able to reach into our lives and teach us things that we otherwise didn't want to know. I'm a great believer in Romans 8:28-29 that all things work together for our good, even the really horrible things, right? But we have to go on to see what Paul means when he says it's for our good. It's not to make us, happy, healthy, and clever. It's to make us like Christ. And so there were issues that I had dealt with all my life that I had struggled with. And I had prayed and prayed and prayed about God sort of helping me overcome these particular issues that I had struggled with. And in the process of being treated for cancer, it was like he, if you think of sort of the sin and the issues in your life as being sort of rocks in the river, right? As long as the water level is really high, then you don't notice them. When the water level gets low, there they are, right? Quite
Yes.
visible. And it was as if in the process of that sort of 2-year treatment cycle that God just backed a truck up, and threw a chain around those rocks and hauled them out of the river for me. I'd always been very sort of self-referenced. I think it was a function of just how I grew up. My family of origin was pretty independent from one another.
Okay.
Right, that we all just
Sure.
sort of went different directions, so we were never terribly close as a family. And so it turns out, though, there's a very short distance between self-referenced and selfish. And I had struggled with that for a long, long time, just being very self-centered and having a hard time thinking about things from other people's point of view. But in the process of being treated for cancer and sort of having to sort of get very tight with God about, am I going to wake up tomorrow? I was able to sort of leave some of that behind, and it's been a great gift to me. So yeah, and I don't say it lightly because, as I say, it's as horrible as everyone says it is. But if you had told me on the front end of that experience that, Larry, it's going to be 2 years of really miserable existence, but at the end of that, you're going to be free of this besetting sin in your life. If you had told me that on the front end, I would have taken the deal because it was that valuable to me.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I know that many listeners probably are going through something very difficult right now. And so I
Yeah,
hope that
right.
encourages them. And it was neat to hear that you taught during that very difficult time. Somebody who has such high position now on our campus, Tucker Glaske, is the vice president of fundraising.
Right.
So
No, I've known some very famous people
very
at UMHB,
famous.
including Mr. Glaske.
Yes. And I happen to know that you actually know a lot of people in this world, including people at Lithuanian Christian College. I understand that you travel to talk about ethics and cloning all over Europe, from what I understand. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say all over by any stretch.
Hmm.
Now, this fall, I was at the European Association of Centers of Medical Ethics to talk about the ethics of human gene editing.
Okay.
Not so much cloning per se, but although some of the technologies would be similar, to talk about human gene editing. I just think it's very important. Right now, there's a moratorium in stage. We have technology to be able to potentially, or have technology that can be developed into technology that would allow us to treat genetic birth defects. Right, 8 million children a year are born with genetic birth defects, and some of them are terribly serious. Right, some of the trisomy birth defects and others, children die in their infancy and they die in terrible pain. Right, wouldn't it be great if we could treat these genetic birth
Absolutely.
defects?
Yes.
And we have technology that can help, that we can develop into being able to treat those things. But there's a moratorium on that technology everywhere in the world. Everywhere in the world. The last person who did it was Dr. He in China. And the Chinese threw him in jail for 3 years, for using this
Okay.
technology. There's a moratorium on it everywhere. And that's because there's these ethical issues associated with it that we just haven't resolved yet. Right? How do we feel about designer babies? How do we feel about people using this technology to make super soldiers? How do we feel about introducing new genetic conditions into the gene pool where they're there forever?
Yes.
Right? How do we
Right.
feel about these kinds of issues? How do we deal with those? And so, because of those ethical problems associated with this technology, there's no development happening in it in terms of human gene editing. And so, I think it's important, those of us who have a faith perspective, can we step into that gap and say, okay, these are the issues that you're struggling with. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about what are the issues involved in human gene editing. The piece I was talking about in Poland was about this risk of transhumanism, right? What if over the course of hundreds of generations, we edit the human genome such that we create a subspecies of people whom we no longer consider human, right? What do we do with that risk when we think about how can we make the world safe to develop this kind of technology so that we can heal more babies? That's sort of the mission there. The Lithuania Christian College connection goes back a long way to my good brother Steve Barnes, who had encountered, yeah, your
Yes.
professor,
My
Stephen
professor.
Barnes.
Yes.
Yeah, he's the man. He had,
I agree.
indeed, as do we all. He had
Yes.
done some service at Lithuania Christian, I think, when he was a Fulbright fellow in Latvia. And he
Yes.
introduced me to some people at LCC. And so I started there probably 6 or 8 years ago. And I've been there a number of times to teach in the summer and sometimes take students with, UMHB students with. I'm a very big believer in what they're doing at Lithuania Christian. I'm actually on faculty there as well now. So I'm a research fellow at Lithuania Christian. I think mostly so that they can get the benefit of all the research that I produce. They can claim that research as their own, which it is, and that really helps them with their accreditation. They're accredited by the government of Lithuania, and they have to be able to show a certain amount of productive research in order to be able to maintain their accreditation as a university. And so it really helps them to be able to claim all of my research. And now in the College of Business, we've started this program where every spring we cross-list a class with Lithuania Christian. So
Really?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you should get in, right?
Okay.
So that it'll meet synchronously, but it'll meet on Zoom. So this spring, as in a year ago or 2 years ago, last spring it was taught by Dr. Michelle Reyna. She taught an international marketing class. 2 years ago, in the spring, I taught an international business law class. Half the classes from UMHB, half the classes from Lithuania Christian. We all meet on Zoom at 8 o'clock, Tuesday, Thursday on my screen together, and we mix it up. Just the two different classes join together,
Yes.
and we get to work together. And then I'll, of course, do some group assignments for them, and always be sure to put them in transatlantic groups so that they have to figure out, oh, okay, you're 8 hours ahead of me. When are we going to meet? How are we going to sort this out? Alessandra and Alexi don't sound like Jim and Bob. You've got to sort of tune your ear to their to their English. You've been there.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's a great experience for our students to be able to be in class, even virtually, with these students from Eastern Europe. And this coming year, in 2024, we're going to start a professor exchange. We're going to send a professor to Lithuania for a week, and they're going to send a professor to us for a week. And we've gotten funding from the European Union to do this professor exchange. So yeah, I've always been trying to sort of bring opportunities for both universities together so that we can help one another. One of those being just to give our students exposure to each other,
Right.
right? Because the
Yes.
European students, some of them many of them will work in America at one point or another, and it'd be good for them to learn how to deal with our guys, and we want ours to be able to know how to deal with them, how what their cultural backgrounds are and what their worldview is. And the fact that they're a devout Christian university makes that all the better. So yeah, I've got some history with them now, and trying to increase the connection between our two schools. I think it's going to be beneficial for both.
I agree. Number one, thank you for embracing such conflicts, questions as a Christian that you spoke about, that you were in Poland. And number two, I just wanted to let our listeners know that at Lithuanian Christian College, they have people from all over Europe.
It's true.
Yes. And so that means that they are serving Christ. And it's very interesting to me because I just came back from a conference centered around faith and culture and how do we find unity as Christians. And at Lithuanian Christian College, they have people from all walks of, not all walks of faith, all walks of Christianity, Protestant, Catholic, that serve Jesus Christ. And they serve students that come from countries that are feuding with each other. It's an international university. And so how do they come together and worship God, Jesus, under these conflicts of your country and my country do not get along? Our people groups do not get along. And so I love that you are bringing that to UMHB students as well, that you guys are meeting in the spring at 8 a.m., because that's not just Lithuanian students and American students. That's students from all over Europe. English, let's see, Ireland.
Mostly Eastern Europe.
Yeah,
right?
mostly.
I mean,
yeah.
Less than half their students at Lithuania Christian are Lithuanian.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of them will come from Russia, Belarus, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan,
Yes.
Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
Last 2 years ago, when I was teaching, 2 springs ago, I had a number of students from Ukraine. One of whom was taking the class from Ukraine because it was online. She could do that. And then I also have students from Russia and Belarus. And okay, how are we going to deal with each other? What's this going to look like, right? And we did a lot of prayer in the classroom and had some frank conversations about, what our goals together were, and sharing our mutual fears. My student who was in Ukraine actually had to disappear for a week. She told me, yeah, we can hear the shelling from my house where she was taking my class. And so she emailed me at one point and said, Dr. Locke, I'm going to be out for a week. But don't worry, I'm caught up on the assignments and everything. And she's a very good student. And the next time we saw her, she popped up, with a completely different background. She and her siblings had fled to Poland. Her mom and dad had given her 2 younger brothers and said, you go to Poland and see if we can keep you guys a little more safe. So yeah, it was quite the event, within the class to sort of see people struggling that way. And I hope that gives our UMHB students a broader worldview, a sense of compassion, for people who are suffering, no matter which. I mean, the Russians and Belarus students couldn't get money from home, right? Because we locked down the payment system. And they were afraid to go home. They were afraid if they went home, they'd be drafted.
Right. In Lithuania right now,
Right.
I met a few people that could not return to their homeland.
Yeah, so everyone is suffering.
Yes.
It's just a question of how you're suffering, sadly. But yeah, to be able to expose the UMHB students to that part of the world and what's going on there, I think could be really valuable. particularly for business students, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I went there with Dr. Barnes. So I was very grateful for that experience as well. I was wondering, so all these connections
Mm.
across the world, and you went to Harvard and Oxford. So how did you end up at the University of Mary Hardin-Baylor?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's easy. I was called here.
Okay.
Yeah, no, the Lord called me to come here. I was teaching at Gordon College up in Massachusetts. And as I mentioned, my older daughter just graduated. My younger daughter was just finished her sophomore year. My son was homeschooled. So we were pretty mobile at that time. We had sold our house that we had had when I was preaching in southern Massachusetts, and my wife was serving as a resident director on Gordon College campus. So we had this very nice 3-bedroom apartment on campus that we were living in. So not a lot of ties, economically or socially to the community there. And so my wife and I were talking with one another and said, well, if we were ever going to return to Texas, this would be the time. We don't have a lot to uproot if we were going to come to Texas. So we started praying about it. And my wife has 3 sisters in Waco. So we sort of centered our search in Waco and began sort of looking around Texas. Okay, is there something here that we need to be thinking about, something that we need to be doing? And I was introduced to UMHB and came down and met Dr. Jim King, then the dean of the College of Business. So for all of those who have been unhappy with Larry's performance throughout, it's really Jim's fault. You should sort of get used to that idea. But I met him, and of course was very taken with him. He's quite the fellow. And of all the different offers that came in, this was the one that I knew I was supposed to do. I knew it was right. I was sort of deep into conversations with Big Baylor about coming to Truett Seminary. They were trying to gear up this organization to work with executive pastorate training. And because I have this sort of lawyer business background and also this theological background, they thought, that would be a good fit for me. So I was deep into conversations with them. I had a verbal offer from East Texas Baptist to come in and be dean of their business school. I had met Dr. Oliver, who was the president there at the time, and he was super fellow. He's now at Union. But he had said, Larry, can you come help us with this? And of course, when Gordon College heard that I might be going, they said, well, here's some money. Why don't you stay? So those were all good things. But I knew that UMHB was where I was to go, in part because it was the lowest paying, lowest ranking opportunity that was provided. And that was a good indicator to me that that's where I was supposed to go. Because, part of the way that I try to make these decisions about where to go, and part of the way I try to train our students to make these decisions, is that it's not about climbing ladders, right? The ladders are an illusion anyway. The ladders aren't real, yeah? But it's about sort of growing in Christ-likeness, trying to grow in holiness. That's what your career is for. That's what it's there for, right? And one of the things that I was struggling with at that time, and have probably all my life, has been sort of struggling with pride. Pride is a bad one, right?
It's easy to fall into.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It is, right? No, C.S. Lewis said it's the mother of all sins, right? It was Satan's sin when we think of it. So pride was something that I'd always struggled with. And the opportunity to come and start over in a brand new place and be, a first-year assistant professor and get the lowest paycheck that I was offered, that sort of told me, yeah, this is the right place for you. This is where you can go and grow in humility. Marginal success on the growing in humility, I'm afraid, but that was the plan. That's how I knew. There were other indicators as well. That's not the end of the conversation, but it's definitely part of the conversation. That was how I knew it was where I was supposed to be.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I know that you have blessed our campus by being here. I have chatted, I've chatted with several students in the College of Business over these last few days because I'm an English major. And so
you don't get over to our side of campus much.
Yes.
Well, you're always welcome.
Thank you.
There's a great opportunities in business for people who can read and write well. Communication is quite critical. So yeah, I hope that, yeah, I mean, think about careers and where you might be able to best serve, and it will almost certainly be in some kind of commercial opportunity. Yes.
Yes.
So how about this? When you're ready to sort of take yourself up, come see us about an MBA. We'll chat.
Thank you so much.
Not at all.
Look, UMHB, go get your master's in business. You'll
Absolutely,
have
you should.
Dr. Locke.
Perhaps, yeah,
Yes.
no, or better.
And
Yeah, you'll definitely
this
either
very wise
Larry or
individual.
better that's what we can promise. Larry
Okay.
or better.
So, very good. Well, I was very curious as well. I hear that you are a missionary's kid.
Yep.
Not a preacher's kid, PK,
Right,
as they're
right.
called, but a missionary's child. And so, what did that mean for you growing up? Where did you live? What was the experience of being a missionary's child? And how are
Yeah.
you now a professor instead of a missionary?
Yeah, right. I mean, I started as my parents were missionaries. My mother was a missionary as a single woman for the Pentecostal holiness. So she was hardcore, right? She moved out to China when she was a young 20-something, lived by herself in a little fishing village in China. It's quite brave,
That
right?
is?
In the
Yes.
1950s, she moved out to live in China by herself. And she was 6 foot tall, right? She was 6 foot tall in a time when women didn't get to be 6 foot tall, especially in China.
She really stood out.
Oh, she
Yes.
did, right? No, she was the only giant Anglo woman in the entire village, right? She was easy to spot, so quite brave in that regard. And she met my father. They married in China, and then came back to the U.S. so that I could be born in the U.S. She actually flew back to the U.S. pregnant with me. And so I was born in the United States, and they stayed there. My father was doing some graduate work, and they stayed in the United States until I was 6, and then briefly in Georgia, and then back to China. And I didn't live in China all that long. I lived there for 6 years, but it was sort of a formative time for me. I lived there from 6 to 12. I don't really remember a lot, before I was 6,
Right.
before I moved there. And I think they moved back to the United States, to Arkansas, when I was 12. And then in order for my brother to go to high school and college in the United States. And then after he got out of college, they moved back to China and stayed there until they retired. A brief stint in Russia, but mostly in China. So yeah, then went to college in Arkansas because they came back. My parents are college professors, right? They're not professional holy men. They were college professors. They came back to teach at a little Christian college in Arkansas. And so I went there because I could go free as a faculty kid. And when you're the son of missionaries, free matters, right? And so I went there. But then they left, went back to China. More or less, as soon as my wife and I got out of college, we moved to Boston the first time, and then back to Texas for 6 or 7 years, and then back to Boston for, 12, 15 years. And then before I came here to UMHB, so there's been a lot of moving around. And I think I credit sort of some of my sensitivity to ministry needs with growing up as a missionary kid. I think I approach all of my work as a form of ministry. I did pastor a church. When I stopped practicing law, I pastored a church. I got called out of the practice of law to pastor a church in southern Massachusetts for 7 years. But all of my pastoring a church or being a professor or being an administrator, it's all ministry. I've done a lot of things, right? I dropped out of college when I was about your age to do some consulting. I was consulting for some banks. And then after I came back and finished college, I worked as a banker for a couple of years. And then I was a law student, and then a lawyer, and then in-house counsel at Fidelity Investments, and then was a pastor, and then a college professor, and now an administrator. I sometimes describe my career as being a sort of slow but steady fall from grace. And hopefully now, as a college administrator, I've sort of reached the bottom. This is sort of where one lands in that fall from grace. And now it's time for the hockey stick to curve back up,
Okay.
right? But all of those, honestly, it's all the same thing. right? You wouldn't have
Right.
thought that necessarily, but it's all the same thing. All I do is I wash the feet of the people who are put in front of me. And sometimes they're called clients, and sometimes they're called borrowers, and sometimes they're called students, and sometimes they're called parishioners. Sometimes they're called faculty. It's all the same. It's all the same work. And I think I can credit sort of that understanding of what it means to work anywhere in the world with the fact that my mom and dad were missionaries and yet not professional holy people. My father's a doctor of psychology. My mom was a sociologist. So yeah, I think being a missionary kid had some influence there, certainly.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. And thank you for being on the podcast today. I am not ready for our time to be over. I would love to sit and chat more, but I know that we both have, well, I have class. I'm a student.
And you should make it to your class,
yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah. First things first.
That's my job right now. So, but we have one last question we ask every guest. What gives you hope for the future?
Oh, wow. It's an important question, particularly in our context, because the higher education world is entering a very difficult phase, right? We've got overcapacity in the university world. We talk a lot about the demographic cliff. The number of students between 18 and 24 is about to decline significantly. And yet it's very difficult to get supply out of the system, right? It's very difficult. It's a very hard thing to close a university. And so they wind up competing with each other in really nefarious ways sometimes. So if you were an investor, you would not look at higher ed right now and say, that's where we should put our money. And yet, I don't think that's terribly important that we're sort of entering that phase, because I'm not here to invest. I'm not here to make money. I'm here for a calling. And in that case, it doesn't really matter sort of what's going on in the industry around us, whether it's an attractive industry or an unattractive industry. So what I think should be the source of our hope in the time to come, whether it's in higher education or in whatever circumstances we find ourselves, is the notion that God is good and that he has a good plan for us. I mean, that is the source of all reliable hope. I've seen it try to come from other places, often to quite terrible ends. So, yeah, I have hope that God is good and that he has a good plan for all of us, despite the hardships that come, even the ones that we can see coming a long way away.
I agree. And that is something to hold on to. So, well, thank you so much for being on the Into the Future podcast. You came highly recommended by so many people.
Well, it's been worth every penny you paid.
Yay! So. Yes, Jason Palmer and our vice presidents, they all were very on board. They said, Larry Locke is coming on the podcast, and that is going to be the greatest podcast ever. So
clearly wrong, right?
No!
I mean, Palmer should stick to preaching, and Palmer is an amazing character, right? I was in Romania with him last December doing mission work. The man is an absolute beast, right? You should ditch the Larry podcast and get Palmer into this chair. That's what you should do. But in terms of predicting who's going to be a good podcast guest, clearly he's missed his calling there. He's missed the mark there.
Well, I disagree. And thank you again for coming. We have thoroughly enjoyed having you, and all the listeners out there, I know that you will enjoy this as well. So have a great day. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Into the Future. We desire that you walk away with encouragement from the stories of hope that you heard today. As you go into your day, remember that the world needs you. You matter and God cares. As Romans 15:13 says, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit.